The following is a CUNY-TV special presentation in collaboration with the Museum of the City of New York. New York Comes Back, the Mayoralty of Edward I. Koch.
My name is Susan Henshaw-Jones, and I am the President and Director of the Museum of the City of New York. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today to launch the exhibition, New York Comes Back, Mayor Ed Koch and the City. This opening event is taking place in the auditorium of the museum's very kind neighbor and collaborator, the Academy of Medicine. New York Comes Back, Mayor Ed Koch and the City examines New York and the mayor's leadership during the years when the city faced a fiscal crisis of enormous proportions. The specific solutions to this crisis, as well as the controversies and setbacks, will be considered by our panelists. This was a local story, but it had national consequences. As New York faltered, pundits predicted the demise of not only New York, but also of the American city as a way of life. Our exhibition interprets the Koch years, the feisty, in-your-face mayor, and the book, edited by Michael Goodwin, presents new scholarship on those years. Michael Goodwin did a terrific job in organizing and editing the book, and I thank him and all of those who wrote the various chapters. You notice that we haven't got Edward Irving Koch up here, and it is true. The mayor this afternoon will be listening. Mayor Koch, beyond your very concrete accomplishments, you are the embodiment of the spirit of all New Yorkers who come here from every place around the globe and who, after a mere matter of months in this city, become feisty, opinionated, generous, and indomitable. I welcome and thank Pete, Ken Auletta, Stephen Berger, Victor Gotbaum, Joyce Purnick, and the Reverend Al Sharpton for being here. So, thank you all very much. Michael?
Believe it or not, in January, it will be 28 years since Edward I. Koch first took the oath as the 105th mayor of the city of New York. And it is almost 16 years since voters made him a private citizen. The 12 years in between were like no other in the recent history of this magnificent city. The Koch years were unique, all energy and change and drama, and yes, conflict. The fate of the city was at stake. It wasn't just the finances sinking us, it was the civic spirit that was sagging too. Once a great metropolis, New York had fallen and it couldn't get up. But it did get up, because Ed Koch pulled it up. In a 1984 interview for a book that I co-authored called I Koch, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan made a bold prediction. He said, "History will record Ed Koch as having given back New York City its morale." Moynihan said Governor Hugh Carey saved the city, but that the city lost much of its independence from the state. He went on, "But people don't feel that," Moynihan said. "It's because Ed Koch has made them feel we are running ourselves again, and we are on our own, and we are the way we have always been." And that is a massive achievement. Indeed it was, but the ride was not always smooth. How could it be with Ed Koch at the helm? One thing was always certain: you knew who was boss. Mayor Koch was so in your face for so long that a whole generation of children grew up thinking Mayor was his first name. He relished a good fight and a good quip. Here are a few of his favorites. "The UN is a monument to hypocrisy, a cesspool. I don't get ulcers, I give them. I'm a liberal with sanity. I'm not a punching bag. You hit me, I hit you back." When he refused to pet a tiger at a Madison Square Garden party, a bystander yelled, "Is the mayor a coward?" To which the mayor responded, "No, the mayor is not a coward, and the mayor is not a schmuck." Then there are those comments he made to Playboy magazine just as he was starting his 1982 campaign for governor. Koch calls them the dumbest he ever made. There's no argument here, considering some of what he said. Quote, living in rural areas is a joke. Have you ever lived in the suburbs? It's sterile. It's nothing. It's wasting your life. He talked about wasting time in a pickup truck when you have to drive 20 miles to buy a gingham dress or a Sears Roebuck suit. And to top it off, to make sure, he said living in Albany would be a fate worse than death. On Election Day, he was spared that fate. His most popular line began in 1969, after he won a seat in Congress. He returned to subway stops to shake hands every Friday. He would ask anyone he met, "How am I doing?" He hasn't really stopped. The time is ripe for a second look at those years. Ed Koch is 80. So we're here today to try to get a clearer picture of those exciting and dramatic times. We are lucky to have such first-class help. I think of our assembled panel as shepherds guiding us to a clearer understanding of the Koch years. And nobody can get us started better than Pete Hamill. Pete is a prolific author and journalist whose keen insights and extraordinary talents have earned him a top spot in American letters. So what we have then is a perfect match. Pete Hamill on Ed Koch and the temper of his times. Pete?
It's hard to believe now, but when Ed Koch took office on the 1st of January 1978, there were neither parades, rallies, preparations for bonfires, or any sense of celebration in the town. The fact was, we had gone through such a terrible time that nobody was prepared to celebrate yet. Some of that time, particularly for you people who are out here who are 30 or younger, is hard to imagine now, and yet it was the thing that faced Ed Koch when he walked into that office at City Hall. In the fall of '75, the fiscal crisis erupted. There were layoffs of cops and firemen and sanitation men and teachers and librarians, all those people that help weave together what we think of as a civilized city. At the same time, the kind of nexus, the gathering together of three factors, youth, drugs, and guns, was bringing a sense of menace to the city that simply wasn't there before. Crime was growing and rampant. The homeless suddenly appeared among us. They were not black or white or Latino, they were everybody. Some of them were those displaced by the burning of the South Bronx and the loss of all those places to live. But some of them were drug addicts, some of them were alcoholics, some of them were lost souls that have always been in this city from the time of the Dutch. At the same time, in the year before Ed Koch ran for mayor, a guy named David Berkowitz, better known as the Son of Sam, was roaming the streets. His little miniature psychopathic crime wave started in July of '76 and didn't end till August of '77. And along came Koch. At the beginning, nobody gave him a chance. He was the classic Greenwich Village liberal. He had gone to the South to march for civil rights. He had opposed the war in Vietnam. He was the object of all the stereotyping that goes on about a place like the Village. And he started running. Nobody paid much attention. Later on, a new player in town named Rupert Murdoch, who had taken over the New York Post, decided that Koch was his man and began to give him a little more ink than he was getting anywhere else. But on July 13th, we had the power failure. 25 hours. Fires erupted everywhere, looting. The police, undermanned as they were, made 3,776 arrests in that 24 hours. and they probably could have made twice that. The sense of despair among many New Yorkers was general. A lot of my friends finally said to me, I'm leaving. I've had the best of it. I grew up here, I lived here, but I'm going. Some of them committed a form of suicide. They moved to New Jersey. Others went to Florida and to, God help us all, California. But they were leaving. They were leaving, and it wasn't simply a matter of us losing their tax revenue. We lost the thing that they were. They were New Yorkers created by the Depression and the war, and full of the feistiness that came from the children of immigrants. And they were leaving us and going out of town. Along came Koch. And in the first month, we suddenly started paying attention in a way we did not during the election and the primaries. Here was a character who was a combination of a Lindy's waiter, a Coney Island barker in the wintertime, a Catskill comedian, an irritated school principal. That's what he always reminded me of. And an eccentric uncle. We all had uncles. Irish, Italian, and Jews all had uncles like Koch at his best. He was the master, suddenly, within 6 weeks, of the cutting, pithy soundbite. He could make you laugh. He talked tough, and the reason was he was tough. People forgot that Ed Koch in World War II was a combat infantryman in the 104th Infantry, was awarded 2 battle stars, and came home a sergeant in 1946. He didn't profit from the war like so many people in New York. He fought it. And so that toughness was underneath what I began to think of, and I'm sure everybody else did, as the act. He also was very wise and intelligent, I think, about the way he approached his job. He knew that he couldn't govern in the traditional sense. Because of the fiscal crisis, the power over money had fallen to Hugh Carey, to Felix Rohatyn, and the Mac board, and a whole lot of faceless bankers. But although he couldn't govern traditionally, he could entertain us. And in a way, that was better. He came at us all with the kind of scorn for weakness, by which I mean self-pity, that all the immigrants and their children had. All sins were permissible in New York except self-pity. And so he would go up and said, and right in the front of people, and say to them, that's not allowed. You can't say that. Forget about being like that. Sometimes, admittedly, he could be ugly in those conversations. Forgive me, Mr. Mayor. Some poor old lady would stand up to raise an objection at a public meeting, and Koch would fire back like a nightclub comedian, squelch her. But most of the time, he'd make you laugh out loud. And it worked. It worked because of what Michael said and what Susan said. He knew that the enemy in New York was not crime, it was morale, that you had to go at it. That like any great politician, he knew he could not solve every problem, but he could manage them. And he went at that with a sense of joy, a sense of combat that was ferocious, with a sense that made us all feel, that's the voice of New York. That's what we are. There were times, too, when I wandered around watching him work, because he was a consummate professional, so you could learn something just by trailing him around a corner, that there was something touching about him, too. When the lights went out, when the rally was over, there was a sense of loneliness off Koch that was, to me, something that made him more human. He talks about it in his book, Citizen Koch. And I think, and we should probably talk about it, one of the problems was that we in the press failed him too. We were covering him and not paying attention to all those little offices where Bartleby the scrivener is sitting in the corner and doing nothing and getting paid. The government was not being covered. The mayoralty was. And in a way, we didn't help him to be more conscious about the organization he was the head of, nor did we help our readers. I always think of him now with enormous affection, although we were never friends. And I think of him in one particular way. He was a huge pain in the ass. But he was our pain in the ass. And we were lucky to have him.
Thank you, Pete. Our first speaker is Steve Berger. Steve was the director of the Emergency Financial Control Board from 1976 to 1977 and from 85 to 90. He served as executive director of the Port Authority, so he knows the bucks. He's now chairman of the Odyssey Investment Partners.
We're going to talk about finances and history. It's a little history, it's a little anthropology, it's a little political sociology. Let me start in 5 minutes. 1, state-city relations. Once upon a time, before one man, one vote, trees and cows voted in this state, and the state legislature was controlled by upstaters. And the city had the wealth was in the city, and we were actually exporters of revenue into the state budget. But secondly, we also had the continuing waves of immigration, first from Europe, and then the movement of people of color into the city. So we had a commitment to very strong social programs in a state in which we really didn't have control of the legislature. If you look back and you use hindsight, you see that in effect a historic deal was ultimately cut. And that historic deal, which we live with today, and you can see in the present Medicaid and welfare cost sharing, was basically a deal which said, unlike almost any other state in the United States, that in New York, the local governments, in this case New York City, would pay half of the state's cost of many of these social programs, fundamentally saying, you guys want to do stuff, you guys can do it, but you're going to have to put butts up out of your own pocket. That's one piece of history. The second piece is that we have to understand that Albany was not just 150 miles away from New York City. And they didn't understand how we work. We did not understand how the state government worked. And there was a total breakdown of information and communication between the two. That was very important. And third, New York's, what happened was over a long period of time, New York City's commitment to social programs led to an arrogance of sort of self-righteousness about its programs, which led us to undertake a range and a scope of programs that a state with full taxing power would have had trouble maintaining. We were continually outspending our budget. And how did the city do this? First, we should not forget the state helped because there were changes in the local finance law which allowed us to borrow like drunken sailors, which we can talk about more. Secondly, the city government spent down all its reserves. By 1975, let me say how broke the city was in 1975. I'll do it simply. It had borrowed effectively every dollar it was going to raise on local revenue for the next year. You know, you start January 1, you got a personal home budget, you've already spent all your income for the next year before you start the year. Now that's exactly where we are. It's over $7 billion, and even in today's terms, $7 billion is real money. We were living on borrowed money. Between 76 and 77, a control process was put in place. That control process, first with MAC and then with the Emergency Financial Control Board, stabilized the situation, created a new financing structure, and gave some tools to the city. Serious budgetary tools and capacity, new accounting systems, financial planning tools, and requirements. But for the city to restore itself and return to self-governance, something Pete mentioned, it had to show it could run itself efficiently and effectively, balance its budget year in and year out. As Ed knows and all of us know, you had bus drivers, you had workers, you had people who'd use city paper to pay for their kids' bar mitzvahs, for their weddings. Everybody was worried about the city finances. It wasn't just big institutions. No one was better prepared. No one who had not been an incumbent. I see the sign, I'll get there. No one who had not been an incumbent was better prepared to take over than Ed Koch. And part of that was, first, he was an observer at the Financial Control Board. He knew you had to do a couple of things. You had to manage the city, you had to persuade the workforce to live with less, you had to restore a capital budget, otherwise we'd still be falling apart. You had to get the credit agencies to believe in us again. And you had to sell New York to all kinds of people who would buy our paper. He surrounded himself with first-rate people, and some of whom are here today, first-rate financial people who understood what had to be done. He brought the energy, he brought the chutzpah that we all knew about. But unlike his predecessors, Ed Koch could balance the books, he could add and subtract, and that's the financial piece that he brought that saved the city.
Our next speaker is the Reverend Al Sharpton, who all of you know, I believe, or know of anyway. He's run for elective office 4 times. And by the way, he has to run out of here soon after he finishes speaking. But he is currently the president of the National Action Network and is working on television and radio projects.
I think that the reason that the mayor and I developed a working relationship is that we found things that we agreed on. And I think that part of the thing that was the most refreshing and the most appalling about Ed Koch is that he will stand for what he believes in. And he will not say what you want to hear. And he will not be intimidated either way. So he had been as adamantly opposed to a lot of the things that I believed as he was adamantly in support of some of the things we came to believe later. He always was a bit of a show person, a showman, and he was a good politician in terms of being able to convince people of things. But I think at the core, he really believed stuff. Now, a lot of the stuff I didn't believe, I didn't agree with then, and some I still don't agree with. But I did not believe over a course of time he was a phony. And I know he was a great salesman, but I think at core he was selling what he believed. I know he's a great salesman because he has my 2 daughters convinced the only reason he was the first person to arrest me was to really help make me famous and kick off my career. In 1978, he had just been inaugurated in January. You must remember we had just gone through in the African American community the election of Jimmy Carter after the Nixon years. We had a lot of hope. There were drives for empowerment all over the country. And we wanted to duplicate that here in New York. The mayor had demanded that the president do something, President Carter do something about the Middle East, so I took it upon myself to say he should also stand up to the president about the cut in summer jobs. So it was on April 4th, 78, which was the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, 14 years at that time, that we arranged a meeting with the mayor. And again, you must admit that at that time, for him to even see 4 unknown ministers showed you he was more open than we gave him credit at the time. Our egos told us that, of course, he should see us, but in retrospect, the fact that he saw us was an indication he was a little more open than we thought. And we said to him we wanted him to demand to the federal government that they replace the cut in summer jobs to youth that summer. And Ed Koch, unlike many, and I heard Pete say he was a traditional liberal, but unlike many liberals at the time, looked at me and said, no, and I'll tell you why. And I said, what do you mean, no? He says, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, well, if you don't, we're not leaving your office. He says, oh, you're leaving, but before you leave, let me explain to you why your approach is wrong. And I think he sensed that activists have a strange job of trying to highlight an issue and also give people hope not to give up at the same time. But in his mind, he had a job to manage the city, and he had a job to, even if he felt our core reason was right, not to have an administration that would appear to not deal with the fact that you had to deal within certain boundaries of the law. So after he lectured us on how the federal government had fiscal problems, the city had fiscal problems, and of course he would want every young person in New York working. It was unrealistic, and that our approach was not the best approach to get him to do it. He then asked the police to come in and remove us. And I remember the young man who was standing there in uniform with handcuffs on, in his hand, said to him, well, we need a complainant. Who's the complainant? He says, I am. Arrest them. I'll sign the complaint. And we were carted out on down the steps of City Hall. It was the first time I was arrested. And some 20-some years later at my birthday, he reminded me, no one ever heard of Al Sharpton until he had me escorted out of City Hall. I think that the mayor inherited a lot of things that, one, we wanted in the African American and Latino community that were working together at that time that would have happened whoever was there. And two, his personality became an easy target because he was so in your face, because he was very glib and open. It became what many of us knew and enjoyed in the early part of his administration. It became offensive to some when we were dealing with issues that really meant a lot to us. And I don't think that he was not as much understanding of the issues as his style caused more of a confrontation, and the times had moved on. And I think that Bensonhurst became a part of that. I think the running for president of Reverend Jackson became a part of that. And I think that over a period of time, we realized that we weren't as anti-him, as pro an agenda, that we wanted to move on. I think that the race relations, because of Howard Beach and on through Bensonhurst and other incidents, became very, very bad. And I think that the legacy of those years was that we did get through it. What no one talks about is that we never had a riot on the scale of South Central or Watts. I think the lasting situation now in the city is we know each other better, and we talked a lot of these issues more. I don't think that we're anywhere near racial harmony, but there is more racial sensitivity than it was. So in terms of racial history, he will go down as one that had to steer the ship through some very turbulent waters. And of course, he will go down in history as the first one to arrest Al Sharpton.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ken Auletta. Ken is an award-winning journalist and the author of 10 books, including 4 national bestsellers. He was a columnist for the Daily News for 16 years, and he now writes for the New Yorker.
Ed Koch understood a fundamental bias of the press, which is not that it's not a political bias, a liberal or conservative bias. It's a bias for conflict. And when he ran for mayor in 1977, he was the most conflict-oriented candidate. And I don't say that in a belittling way. What I mean by that is he believed that the city government, the city administration of Abraham Beame, was much too compromised. He believed that special interest ruled the city, including my friend Victor Gotbaum. That was the belief at the time.
I'm glad I got one friend.
He believed that a mayor had to stand up and speak for what he perceived to be the common interest. And he spoke those words sharply, and the press loved hearing that. The truth is, I think, Pete, in your quite acute presentation, I think Murdoch is important in Ed Koch's victory that year in 1977, but something happened before Murdoch stepped in and gave him a reason to step in, and that is that Ed Koch was putting out the most detailed position papers, speaking out most forcefully of all the 7 candidates, and making enemies, as Reverend Sharpton said, standing up to people and not trying to placate them. And that obviously married very well with the press's interest in conflict, but it also married very well with the mood, as Pete described, of the city at that time. And then what happened, the second big thing I think that happened is, as Pete said, that Murdoch stepped in. And he not only endorsed Ed Koch early, the New York Daily News endorsed Ed Koch, the Times endorsed Mario Cuomo, but what Murdoch did that year, which was very unusual, is that he not only turned over the editorial page to Ed Koch, he turned over the front pages to Ed Koch. And so he rewarded him with enormous coverage and punished, oftentimes, many of the people who opposed Ed Koch. I think that if you watched the mayor, as a congressman, he did not fill a room. He was tall. In fact, many people thought he was a tall A-beam at first. We knew he was smart. We knew he was outspoken. We didn't know he was colorful. We had not heard the jokes. We had not. And in fact, I think Ed Koch, after he was elected, was transformed. I think he became a fuller personality. And I think he filled that room. And so what happened starting in '78 when he took over, the press would come to his press conferences. And he understood a second bias that the press has, not just for conflict, but a bias to be entertained. He gave great sound bites, just great sound bites. And the press, particularly TV press, played up that. And as Pete said, it later caused problems because we tended to focus more on the personality of the mayor and we tended to ignore too often the government. But he didn't ignore the government. He governed this city, and as Steve said, he knew how to add and subtract and balance the budget and stand up to people and say no to people. And that was an extraordinary achievement. But what Ed Koch did, I think, is it was very charming for a long period of time, his asking that question, "Hi, how am I doing?" But after a while, particularly with the media, it wears thin, and you look for a new shtick, a new act. And in truth, I always believed that there was another question he should have been asking, which is, "Hi, how's my government doing?" And ultimately what happened by his third term, that second question became more dominant. And I think Ed Koch and the administration lost altitude. But if you look back on those 3 terms, what you see, and it's been attested to here rather remarkably by each speaker, what you look back and see is a mayor who performed in a way that no mayor had since LaGuardia, and who will stand the test of history. Not just because, as Pete eloquently said, he gave us back our morale, but he gave us back our self-governance. Not insignificant event. So I salute him as a mayor. And the press did too. In fact, one last thing. The first year he was mayor, in fact, the first day he was mayor, he allowed me to come and follow him and be a fly on the wall for the New Yorker magazine and do a 2-part series on him, which took me the better part of a year and a half, I think. And he said, "I have nothing to hide." I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, let me see your correspondence." He said, "Okay, here's my correspondence." And I said, "Let me see this oral history you've given up at Columbia." He said, "Here's my oral history at Columbia." Whatever I asked for, if I wanted to sit in a meeting, he allowed me to do that. Now, we went through a period after I wrote my piece that he was not so happy with me. But
Really?
But we had lunch recently.
Joyce Purnick writes the New York Times Metro Matters column, and as the newspaper's City Hall bureau chief from 1985 to 1988, she was a fixture in Room 9 during the Koch years. Joyce, you've seen a lot of politicians in your career of covering them, and yet Ed Koch in many ways redefines the term of evolution. He went from being a village reformer and a fierce opponent of the bosses to making alliances with some of those same Democratic leaders who were at the root of the corruption scandal that marred his third term. He was a liberal, and then he wasn't. Looking at the arc of Ed Koch's career, could you describe his politics?
No. Before I start, I just have to say that I know I'm getting old when I hear the Reverend Al Sharpton speaking in laudatory terms of Ed Koch, because anyone who was around in those times, I mean the bitterness, the animus. All right. All right. I'm going to try to summarize a half-century of Ed Koch's political evolution in 5 minutes with everyone in the room, including him, surely confident of his or her own versions of history. It's not in dispute he was a Greenwich Village liberal who moved to the center, some say to the right, as he saw more and experienced more in government. He liked to call himself a liberal with sanity, but I don't even know what those phrases mean anymore. The changes in the city during John Lindsay's years, the anger of the white middle class, exemplified by the Forest Hills housing development that figures so largely in Ed's pre-mayoral history, the rise of crime, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, the failings of the schools. They all dominated, I think, in Ed's move away from his old village roots. I'm not convinced he was ever quite the classic village / West Side liberal that some people thought he was. I think we didn't know. I'm not sure, Ed, that you knew. I suspect he was not, however, that traditional liberal, and that the change to centrism or to the right was underway quite early in Ed Koch's career. I don't think that his focus in his political youth was as ideological as it was tactical, running against the clubhouse and the bosses. I think that in office it's fair to say that Ed Koch wasn't as revolutionarily a centrist as he might have wanted to be. He was a fiscal conservative in his first term, but there were the unions to get along with, and they could not ultimately be enemies. They can in an election, but they cannot really be when you're governing. There was a board of estimate to deal with, and a state legislature to get legislation through, and you can't be fighting with everyone all the time. Although a subsequent mayor did, but that's another story. There were the realities. He had roots in the traditional Democratic Party. If his inclination was to govern more as Rudy Giuliani did eventually, and even Giuliani, I think, didn't stray as far from the traditional as he would like us and now the rest of the country to believe. Anyway, if Koch wanted to govern that way, I don't think he really could in reality. Instead, Koch, as others have said, made alliances with those leaders. He said he did so to govern, to get legislation through Albany, and to get initiatives through the Board of Estimate, and I'm sure that was part of it. I think the other part, forgive me, Ed, was ego. I think Ed wanted and got the support of the leaders for his campaigns. I have always felt that by developing those relationships with them, Koch signaled his acceptance of those leaders and the way they functioned inadvertently to those responsible for the corruption scandal of the mayor's third term. Now, not even Koch's harshest critics, including those who are critics today, none of them would ever accuse him or have ever accused him of personal corruption. The problem, I always thought, in the third term, beyond third-termism, was twofold. One was what I just described. The bad guys thought they could get away with it because the political bosses were back in the fold. The other problem, I'm convinced, was Koch's naivete. As Sam Roberts wrote in his piece in this book about Koch and the corruption scandal, the mayor acknowledged at the time that he had allowed Democratic leaders to exert undue influence over the city government, but insisted, and nobody proved otherwise, that he was as surprised as anyone at the price they exacted. Quote, this is a quote from Ed Koch, "I am embarrassed, I am chagrined, I am absolutely mortified that this kind of corruption could have existed and that I did not know of it." That he said at the time, not subsequently. I do not think that ultimately the corruption scandal will be anywhere near the center of Koch's place in history. It will be a part of his history, but I think it will be overshadowed by what I see as two pieces of his legacy. One, as we've discussed, getting the city back on track after the fiscal crisis with a kind of spirit and energy that the city needed and of which the entire world took note. The Brooklyn Bridge business during the transit strike, the how am I doing stuff, the unstoppable ego. And part of the media stuff was that he loved to talk to us. He loved to see his quotes in print. And we loved to listen. Well, sometimes we did. And I think, second, that Koch was a harbinger of a major change in the way we think about governing large cities. He began the change from the old coalition of labor, liberals, minorities, and the clubhouse, and that has since taken us through Giuliani to Bloomberg, a mayor who, in my view, is an apolitical character who's more of a city manager than a classic mayor. It's popular today to credit Giuliani with shaking up the city's politics as usual. I know that. I think it began with Koch. I think he took it as far as he and his roots would let him and the realities that he and we lived under. He bent the rules. Giuliani violated them. Bloomberg ignores them. and is writing his own with his wealth. Ed Koch wrote his own with his personality and with his spirit and with his evolving politics. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Victor Gotbaum, who was for more than 20 years the executive director of New York's District Council 37, the largest urban labor union in the United States. He now directs the National Center for Collective Bargaining at Baruch College.
This is really oxymoronic. For me to be up here praising Ed Koch, I can't believe it. I really can't believe it. And yet, it's interesting. He was tough. He didn't discriminate when he took office. He zinged everybody he thought didn't fulfill the job of helping the city. And I must say that at the beginning, I didn't dislike Ed Koch. I despised him. I just think, this guy is really bad. But a woman who both Ed and I admire, I happen to be married to her, she said this jeopardizing our marriage. She said, you know, the reason that you don't like him is that you and he are so alike. I did talk to her for at least 6 minutes, which is the longest time that I did not talk to her. But there's an interesting aspect to Ed. His enemies made him. His enemies really made him. That 80s strike, any labor leader knows that you can't win the hearts of the public if you go on strike. It's unfortunate, but you really can't. There may have been 1 or 2 strikes where you struck with workers who were really oppressed, but in the main, you take a terrible, terrible beating. In the 80s strike, it really, I think, really made Ed. He took a strong stand. That walk across the bridge, if you all recall, where he led the group to break the strike. Labor might have hated him for it, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing. He really turned it around. And he would make statements that lots of people thought about. One of the famous statements he made was calling a group poverty pimps. Terrible. Terrible thing to do. And, but deep down in our belly button, we knew there was a group of poverty pimps who made hay out of poverty. To define Ed, I'll talk about, one of my own negotiations with him, the 35 layoffs. He wanted 35 layoffs, and I approached him, and I knew that if I took him head on, it would be a bad mistake. If I said, you can't lay these guys off, forget it. They were dead. So I negotiated with them on the changing of titles for them, where they would do work whether we would get federal money. He listened, and after he said, "You mean I can't lay them off?" He did listen. And then I discovered something else about him. He could negotiate, and he would negotiate. And we negotiated these people back on the job. But I'm not going to make all of this very nice, but the only major reason that Koch and I got along later on and our friendship grew is Betsy liked them. And I thought this was a real perversion. And no, she says, you really both alike. You're stubborn, etc. But she mentioned two things that stay with me. That Ed Koch didn't represent the city. He was a piece of the city. He was a part of the city. You couldn't divorce Ed Koch from the city. It was his city. And that, for that alone, if he had vices, and he probably had a lot of them, you had to understand and work with him. The other aspect of it, as being a piece of the city, I can't think of another word. I was trying to think of another word. But he was pure schmaltz. He was really pure schmaltz. But I mean in a positive sense. I mean that in a positive sense. That he was so much a part of the city that he could get away with it. And he could do things that other mayors couldn't do. So when we kind of give him credit for courage, it was his brashness, his moving forward, and his feeling, his strength, that he was doing the right thing for this city. And so he was. And I will conclude with that point that I believe. Ed Koch was a piece of the city. You couldn't divorce it. This is where he lived, this is what he loved, and because of this, I could negotiate with him, get angry at him, do all kinds of things, but I knew he would never, never, never knowingly hurt the city that he loved so much. Thank you.
I'd like to pose a question to each of the panelists, and I think it's probably something that everyone has thought about and been asked from time to time, and it's this. Of all the New York City mayors of the 20th and 21st centuries, where would you rank Ed Koch? You probably know them all.
I think he'd be second or third after LaGuardia. You think of him in a way, if you had to write a novel about a mayor of New York, you'd rather write about Koch than Bob Wagner. You'd rather write about Koch than Abe Beam, which would be like writing a history of a turnip or something. But I think the three have been LaGuardia, and I only saw him in action when I was a little boy. LaGuardia, Koch, and Giuliani. First term, not the second term, which was a comic opera up until September 11th.
Steve?
The number is hard. It's clearly in that ranking. I think that, you know, and I really focus more on the first two terms, where I think that, you know, Ed, what Ed did in those terms, a lot like what LaGuardia had to do, and again, like Giuliani's first term, was he was both an architect and an engineer. You know, if you think about it, he was the architect, he was an engineer, he was the cheerleader, and he put a lot of, not only did he put stuff together, but he put it together in a way that it's held up, by and large now, for 35 years. I mean, that's got to put him right up there in that top rank, because if you think about the structures of the city which keep it governing, which allow it to be governed and to be successful today, a lot of that stuff was put in place. Maybe, you know, some of us in the control operation may have created it, but it took a mayor to make it the cities, and Ed did that, so he's right up there.
And no one can really challenge that now. I mean, it's established, not just by law, but by practice.
Yeah, I mean, you can nip at those edges pretty good, but the center has held.
Joyce?
That sounds right to me. I mean, I know we're not talking about LaGuardia here, but everybody puts LaGuardia at the top, and I have a feeling a lot of that is myth. And that there were a lot of things about LaGuardia that, if put into the context of today's governing, we wouldn't think was so great. So I'm not sure where if I knew more about LaGuardia, I could find out more about LaGuardia. I'm not sure where I'd put the ranking. But yeah, I think those are probably the right choices. I agree. Well, just one more point. I probably shouldn't say in the middle of a campaign, but Bloomberg has accomplished a lot of what Giuliani claimed to have accomplished. And I think when we see his tenure in retrospect, it's a lot of that will become a little clearer. You need, as we're proving tonight, as I say, whatever it is, you need the distance of time to put these things in perspective.
Well, one reason, of course, is to see what lasts.
Well, exactly. And when what follows.
Yeah, right. Ken?
It depends on whether you count Bob Moses as a mayor. But I think that
Let's count them.
Well, then you have to assess whether his influence is good or bad. But his influence is profound in terms of New York and the state. But I think Ed Koch is ranked right up there, right after LaGuardia. I agree. You know, I once had a conversation with you, Carrie, after he was governor, and I said to him, I'm curious whether Ed Koch, I suspect Ed Koch may have the same reaction. I said to Carrie, I said, you know, you're probably going to go down as maybe the third best governor in this century. And he said, really? He said, who the hell are the other two? I want to know when we get to the question period whether Ed Koch asked the same question.
Victor?
I think we've all said it. To me, the main thing about Ed is something I would say about everybody. Be true to yourself. Be true to what you believe. Don't care where the hell it goes. This is what you feel. This is what you believe. And this was the most positive thing to me about Ed. You know, this is, if he believed it, it's yeah, you didn't like the fact that he used the word poverty pimps. But deep down in a lot of people's hearts, there were poverty pimps out there making money out of poverty. He said it. And you know what? Not that he got away with it. That it touched a chord in so many people. And this, I think, is the important thing about it.
If you could change one thing about those 12 years, what would it be? Pete?
I think he didn't pay enough attention to Bob Dylan and Subterranean Homesick Blues. Particularly the line, "Don't trust leaders, watch the parking meters." In many ways, it's something admirable that he did not see people as potential felons. you wouldn't get Breslin to look at them that way, or many people who live in this city. But he trusted some people who betrayed his faith, and I think that's not something to be ashamed of. I'd rather meet people who trusted people than consider them cynically as all potential traitors of some kind. But I think that would be the one thing to have been more, that wised up attitude he had didn't extend far enough to the people that he hired.
Steve, if you could wave a magic wand and change the past, what would it have been?
Well, somebody's actually talked about the quotes, which I think was a mistake. We've never really had a mayor who I think had more potential for doing what should have been done in the state and still hasn't been done, which was to take all the cities and all the counties, all of whom as local governments share the same sets of problems, as opposed to, and lead them in what is fundamentally against a state bureaucracy, a state government, and a state legislature, which is clueless about, by and large, local county needs. We've never had somebody who had really, that I can think of, who had the political skills and the political instinct to have put that kind of a coalition together. The problem is you have to go north of the city border to do it. But I wish Ed had done that, because his charm and his style could have maybe made a difference. But as we heard, it was not his most affectionate venues during his life.
Could he have done it as mayor?
Oh yeah, you see, I think you can do it. He was so much a New Yorker, I'm not sure, but yes, you can do it. Because in fact, every one of those guys all over the state, whether you're the Erie County executive or the mayor of Syracuse, has some of the same problems that the city of New York has, and you really don't get a hearing from that point of view in Albany. And I think the mayor of the city of New York, not alone, in a real coalition with some of those guys, could have made and could make today a real difference in the state. If Ed had done that, it would have been sort of the second piece of the foundation, which would have changed the way local governments worked.
Joyce?
I probably would say what Ed would say, I think, which is the word he used so often to describe the mistake of '82 running for governor, hubris. I mean, but you take the hubris, you go down a few pegs, and then you don't have Ed Koch. So it's double-edged, you know. But maybe a half a peg.
Ken?
You go back to the Greek mythology and you find that the heroes, their virtue is also their vice. And I think if you remove Ed Koch's vices, his sometimes narcissism, his preoccupation with self and being on the stage, you also remove some of his virtues. And I think that's just inevitable. And that's the point, implicit in the point that I think Pete made about, I'm sure that's the great regret that Ed has in his third term. But I think that the good comes with the bad, and the bad with the good.
It's a package deal. Victor? If you could change the past, what one thing would you change about the Koch years?
I wouldn't let him get elected.
All right. Let's end it on that note. I want to thank you all for coming.